Now, for our final speaker of the night, the premise of the question that brings us here, that there is such a thing as the present moment, which intentionally living within is worth pursuing, well, that presumes that there's also such a thing as not being in the present moment. Is that possible? Where can we be but here, present? When can we be but now, in this moment? The greatest minds of history have explored this paradox throughout time. That required them to define consciousness and to invent frameworks to articulate where it all seems to get jumbled up. Here to share his insights is a graduate student of philosophy at the University of Edinburgh, my friend and colleague, Marcel Ettesvold.
Thank you, everybody. Just to preempt this, Travis gave me the call that I would be doing this 48 hours ago, so you are going to get a very verbatim speech on hard philosophy. Let's go. There is a piece of advice that floats through our culture like smoke, appearing in meditation apps, on motivational posters, in the breathless language of wellness retreats, in the council of therapists, and the declarations of philosophers. Be present, live in the now, the present moment is all there is. We nod when we hear it. We've all felt the truth somewhere in our body, those rare moments when time seemed to thicken, when we were entirely where we were, when the noise of the mind fell quiet and something simpler and more vivid came forward. We know the experience the words are pointing at, and yet the advice, as ordinarily given, is nearly useless. Not because the experience it names is false, but because it never answers the harder questions hiding beneath the easier one. What exactly is the present moment? Not as a point on a timeline, but as something lived. And what is it that lives it? What is the thing that either inhabits the present or fails to? These questions lead quickly and unavoidably to one of the oldest puzzles in all of philosophy, the question of consciousness. Because before we can ask what it means to be present, we must ask what it means to be aware at all. I want to argue today that presence is not a location in time, but a mode of consciousness. A particular way that awareness can be oriented toward its own contents, and that the reason most of us struggle to inhabit it is not weakness of will, but a misunderstanding of what consciousness actually is and how it works. Let us begin where we must, with the strangeness of consciousness itself. Philosopher David Chalmers gave a name to what he called the hard problem. Not the question of how the brain processes information, but the question of why any of this processing is accomplished by experience at all. Why is there something it is like to see the color red rather than simply a neural event? Why does the warmth of anything rather than simply being a measurement of registered and acted upon experience? This remains, as Chalmers argues, genuinely unsolved and possibly unsolvable within our current frameworks. I raise this not to begin with despair, but because the hard problem bears directly on what presence is. If there was nothing it is like to be you listening to this sentence, then being present would be a non-question. The very fact that presence matters, that we notice its absence and hunger for its return, presupposes that consciousness has a qualitative dimension that can be more or less vivid, more or less here. William James, who gave us the first serious phenomenology of consciousness in English, described it not as a thing, but as a stream, a continuous, ever-changing current in which no moment is quite like any other. Consciousness for James is the movement. The present moment is not a bead on a stream. It is an eddy in a current, always becoming the next eddy before we have quite finished inhabiting this one. Which means that presence cannot be achieved by freezing the stream. It is the quality of being fully in the moment, alive to it, rather than running alongside it on the bank, watching it go by. Edmund Husserl, who spent his career studying what he called the internal time consciousness of experience, discovered something that deepens the picture. Even in the most immediate moment of awareness, consciousness is never inhabiting a pure, isolated now. Every present moment carries a retention, a just fading trace of what has immediately preceded, and a protension, a leaning forward into what is about to occur. These are not memories and anticipations in the ordinary sense. They are the living edges of the present itself. What this tells us is that the mind's reach into the past and into the future is not a problem to be solved. It is the form of experience itself. The question is whether that reach is free and responsive to what is actually here, or whether it is captured, running on the rails, laid down by fear and unfinished grief. Consciousness has a property that has fascinated philosophers across every tradition that has seriously examined it. It is reflexive. It is not only aware of the world, it is aware of itself being aware. Jean-Paul Sartre described this with precision, saying there is a difference between what he called pre-reflective consciousness, that's consciousness simply absorbed in the world, in the activity, in the other, and reflective consciousness, which has stepped back and made its own flow an object of awareness. Pre-reflective consciousness is the swimmer swimming. Reflective consciousness is the swimmer watching herself swim. The gap that opens between the two is where most of our absence lives. Thomas Nagel gave us the most famous thought experiment in philosophy of mind with his essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? His point in that essay was that consciousness involves a subjective perspective that cannot be fully captured from the outside. There is always an inside experience that third-person description leaves untouched. What I want to borrow from Nagel is simpler, the recognition that presence is not a presence of the body in a location. It is the full inhabitation of the subjective perspective that is already always yours. You cannot subtract what it is like from experience and have experience remain. The presence we are seeking is not something we import into the moment. It is the quality of the moment when the subjective perspective stops managing itself, simply receives what is there. The great Vedantic philosopher Adi Shankara, working in 8th century India, arrived at a description that converges strikingly with these Western accounts. He argued that pure consciousness is not an object among other objects. It is the light by which all objects are seen. It cannot be made into an object of awareness because it is awareness itself. Consciousness is not something you have, it is what you are. And the search for presence at its deepest level, not a search for a better relationship to the world, it is a search for a more direct relationship to the knowing that is already and always here prior to the stories it tells about itself. If presence is the natural condition of consciousness, we need to explain why it is so rarely our experience. Why does awareness so consistently abandon the present? What is it running toward or away from? Heidegger described what he called fallenness, the tendency of human existence to lose itself in the anonymous comfort of what one does, what they say, what everyone believes. We flee from the anxiety of authentic existence, from the confrontation of our own finitude, our own groundlessness, into the busyness of a life that never quite arrives. The mind replaying the past is usually a mind trying to rewrite it. The mind projecting into the future is usually a mind trying to pre-manage anxiety. Both movements are consciousness attempting to solve through temporal displacement and anxiety that is actually about the present. Pascal noticed this 4 centuries ago with devastating brevity. All of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Not because we are lazy, but because stillness brings us face to face with what we spend enormous energy avoiding. The fact of our own existence, its brevity, and its ultimate uncontrollability. Schopenhauer described consciousness as perpetually in the grip of what he called a will, a blind, insatiable striving that is never quieted. Consciousness is driven by wanting things to be different, wanting more, wanting the future to be controllable. And all of this wanting is, by definition, a flight from the present, which is always and already what it is. Schopenhauer believed that aesthetic experience, particularly music, offered a temporary escape. In genuine absorption, the will quiets, the wanting ceases, and the consciousness simply is. He called this willless contemplation, and we may recognize the experience even if we reject his metaphysics. There's a distinction that appears across multiple traditions that is central to understanding what presence actually requires. It is the distinction between the contents of consciousness, thoughts, sensations, and emotions, and consciousness itself considered as the knowing field in which those contents appear. In the Vedanta, the concept of Sakshi, the witness, refers to the aspect of consciousness that is aware without being identified with what it is aware of. I'm gonna let that one sit for just a second. The Sakshi sees thoughts without being the thoughts, notices fear without being afraid. This is not detachment, it is a more present to experience than the mind that is identified with its contents, because it is not struggling against what it sees or reaching for something other than what is here. Philosopher Douglas Harding arrived at something similar through an experiment almost embarrassingly simple. He tried to look at what was doing the looking. He found not a face, but an open, unbounded space of awareness. From the first-person perspective, consciousness does not encounter itself as an object, it encounters itself as openness, the space in which everything else appears. This is what was meant when saying consciousness is the light by which all objects are seen, and it is directly relevant to presence. If consciousness is by nature open and without boundary, if its apparent contraction into a small, dependent, anxious self is a learned habit rather than its nature, then presence is not something we must create, it is something we must stop obscuring. There is one more dimension of consciousness that bears on presence, and it is the one that is most often admitted. The fact that consciousness is never fully solitary. Hegel argued that self-consciousness itself is not originally private, it arises in and through the encounter with another self-consciousness. I know myself as a self because I am known by another. Martin Buber spent a career distinguishing between what he called I-it and I-thou. In the I-it relation, the other person is an object in my world. In the I-thou relation, there are two centers. The gap between self and the world narrows. The self's monitoring quiets because something more compelling is present, an actual other consciousness pressing back. These moments of genuine encounter are, for Buber, among the most reliable portals into presence. Not the dissolution of the self, but its fullest aliveness in contact with something genuinely other. Let me turn to the practical question. If presence is a mode of consciousness rather than a location in time, if it is obscured by reflective self-monitoring rather than by failure of effort, if it is not created but revealed when the dependent selfhood relaxes, what in the course of an ordinary life do you actually do? The first thing is to stop trying to arrive. Every effort to get in the present moment immediately activates the goal-directed, outcome-evaluating dimension of reflective consciousness, the very mechanism that produces absence. Krishnamurti spent decades insisting on this. Presence cannot be achieved through any method because every method is a future-directed activity of thought that makes the present instrumental. What he advocated against was what he called choiceless awareness, a mode of attention fully alert to what is arising without either suppressing it or pursuing it. Not the watching of a watcher, which would again be reflective consciousness doubling back on itself, but something prior. The natural luminosity of awareness when it is not being directed by the agenda of the self. Tibetan Buddhist tradition offers the clearest image for this. Rinpoche, different Rinpoche than was mentioned earlier tonight, described it as the difference between clouds and the sky. The clouds are the contents of the consciousness, thoughts, emotions, moods. The sky is consciousness itself, open, clear, unaffected by whatever passes through it. Presence is not the removal of the clouds, it is the recognition that you are the sky. The clouds do not have to stop. They only have to be seen for what they are, passing weather in an open space that has never actually been closed. Practically speaking, this means three things. First, appropriate challenge. Research into what has been called flow shows that presence arises most reliably at the edge where the demand of the situation and your capacity to meet it are exactly matched. Boredom and overwhelm are both enemies of presence. When there is too little demand, the self's monitoring wanders. When there is too much, it panics. But at the edge, when you are genuinely required, the monitoring has no bandwidth left for distraction. Genuine skill, genuine conversation, genuine encounter. These demand enough of you that something older and simpler than self-consciousness takes over. Second, the willingness to be where you actually are. Sounds redundant, but it is not. Most of us spend considerable energy resisting our actual situation, the particular constraints, losses, uncertainties of life that we are in fact living. Excuse me. The resistance is itself a form of temporal flight. Presence does not require accepting everything as good or permanent. It requires meeting what is here as it actually is, rather than through the filter of what you wish it were. To put it plainly, the only thing in our power is how consciousness relates to what arises. The relating is what is happening now. Third, genuine contact with other people, not the management of impressions, but actual listening. Letting another person's reality land on you rather than processing it for what it means for you. This dissolves the defended contraction of self-consciousness more completely than hours of solitary practice, because it replaces the self's internal theater with something it cannot fully script. Another mind, genuinely present, pressing back. The philosophers I've drawn on tonight are not pointing at different things. They are circling the same thing from different angles. The difference between consciousness that is contracted, defended, self-referential, and running, and consciousness that is open, present, luminous, and here. The first kind is not defective. It is doing what it has learned to do, largely in response to real difficulties and real pain. But it is not the whole of what consciousness is. It was written in Greece that consciousness at its deepest level is not separated from what it knows. The knower and the known are one. This is presence, not the fusion of subject and object, but the recognition that the gap between them was always, at some level, a construction. What does it mean to be in the present moment? It means to be conscious, to let consciousness be what it already is, open, awake, and here. Not to add something, not to achieve something, but to stop, for a moment, the constant project of being elsewhere. And to notice that there is a quality of awareness that has been present all along, unchanged by the weather passing through it. The river does not need to be told to flow. Presence does not need to be manufactured. It is what consciousness is when it stops pretending it is somewhere else. You're already in it. You have always been in it. The question is only whether, right now, you know it.